does meaning have to be a question of authority or authoritativeness, or searching for a single
use the text together with meaning. Okay, now we have this sort of semantic layer. But the next stage is religion. So he talks about rituals without religion, rituals without meaning. He wants to get back to that kind of baseline. So he sees kind of these layered, what he calls an evolution of human beings. Now, I mean, again, I'm not talking about the evolutionary model so much as, but it's still interesting.
The colonizer, right? Like, what are these funky people doing? I'm going to talk about it and draw my pictures and try and pick them apart.
Patterned, repetitious actions and dealing with kind of sheer materialities like land or something. That we would then need, something would need to push us to meaning, to raise the problem of meaning. And so we seem to all, well, yeah, we were all sort of kind of agreeing up to that point. Then the question was, well, is it just difference or just otherness that we have to explain that then introduces the problem of meaning? And that kind of maybe was a little fork in the road in the group in the sense that some were okay with difference and otherness and some wanted to talk about a difference between just difference and a difference that produces a crisis of some kind. That difference isn't enough, or is difference enough to introduce the problem of meaning?
Which performed the point itself, right?
Yeah, and I think it was theory of ritual, but he develops it on the Vedic case. On his whole theory of the meaninglessness of ritual. As part of his larger theory of ritual, he ends up saying, we're not homo symbolicus, we're not meaning makers first and foremost, we're homo ritualis. That what we share actually fundamentally with non-human animals is ritual. They're animal rituals, human rituals, and then he has a whole theory of evolution, and briefly just he talks about ritual, then you have language, and then you have religions that come along and create whole meaning-making systems. He wants to get back to the fundamentals, what he calls syntax of ritual, explaining the structures and syntax of ritual mathematically without recourse to semantics at all. And he uses the notion of the science of ritual to explain the structures, the syntax.
It might be the product of weird gods.
More or less.
But that point about encountering the other, Vincent raised the question of, is it the problem of modernity? And that Europeans, as they move across other worlds, encounter strange people, strange gods, do they generate then a sense of the other, and does meaning-making come out of, is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I think that was quite interesting, because for me as well, I think meaning leads us into the pit of recanonization. You know, the politics of reinscribing force or power. So,
how does that line up with your point about Fristal's first order of ritual, and then after that is meaning? Because it seems they can't be just random actions, because ritual itself is action that is endowed with meaning.
Yeah, and this may be covered in the next sort of publication from ISS. Mine's on reserve, so we'll see what happens. But I just think talking about a stable human as a way of getting at meaning is kind of troubling unless you bracket human, right, as part of the problem itself, right, as part of the sort of rhetoric of making meaning, as a useful tool. And so in trying to determine where or when meaning comes about, I think linking that to a sort of stable, well, here are human beings, this is what they do, they are meaningful people, is a little, I don't see it. I think we're much more, I think part of the contribution of ISS actually is looking at the ability of certain communities to enforce their scriptural regimes more than others, such that we forgot the ones that we trampled in the process. Unpacking that and those sort of trajectories seems to be a better way of indexing meaning and how it develops, and perhaps even what it is in the first place.
Yeah, I guess I'm going back to birdsong and ethology as a part of the conversation, which in a way destabilizes the notion of the human as a self-enclosed point of reference for talking about what humans do. So I think it cuts both ways, that what Stahl is doing is noticing how certain kinds of ritual practice sit cheek to jowl with what ethologists study as pattern behavior that is definitely ritualized, has a syntax to it, you can describe it and predict it, and it happens that way, that looks remarkably like human ritual, but doesn't have the meaning-making stuff in it. On the other side, in a book called Why Birds Sing, which is trying to explain why birds do what they do, it's pointed out that these kind of default explanations for it as either territorial or sexual actually don't explain birdsong. That it may be, but there are too many instances of birdsong that seems to be performance, such that in fact humans aren't the only ones who perform their life in ways that can't be reduced to instinctual behavior. And so, which I think actually complicates the notion of meaning making, at least a certain kind of performative activity as the characteristically human. That's my contribution in the area of ornithology.
Okay, Barbara and then Dave.
So when you said that, yeah, you know, whenever we think about what Stahl's doing in relation to this, I think it's animals, and that what we call meaning making, where people want to separate, say humans are meaning makers, and that's what separates us. He would say, no, we should actually, he wants to break down the distinction between human and natural sciences, and he wants to talk about us as non-human animals who share all these things with human animals, and develop a whole evolutionary model for humanity. So it's a big project there. But one thing I think he's basically saying is there's nothing in a way of talking about meaning, but he wants to say what we're doing with ritual, in his approach to Vedic ritual, very complex rituals, he wants to describe the syntax, the logic, and again, he uses algebraic formulae to do so. And he says we don't have to now investigate the meanings, because he sees those as a kind of second layer that were imposed upon, that there's no intrinsic meaning to the syntax. It's a second level reflection on the syntax. So in that sense, when he's not saying that you can't, that there's not communication going on.
Meaning making is not discontinuous from play, from excess. That's what meaning is, right? It's what's exceeded by, I mean this, all of the invisible things that you can't see that I, am intending to say right now, but that is coming out in whatever language I can speak, right? Or that I'm trying to relate to you. So meaning is excess, an attempt to express that, and I don't think it's discontinuous from birdsong or play or, affective demonstration of chimpanzees around waterfalls. I mean, it's something that Jane Goodall studied. So I wouldn't want to foreclose it. In fact, I think that is what it is in scripturalization, is the foreclosing of other people's ability to mean. Right? But this is what we were talking, part of what we were talking about in our group, and Rosman actually had a pushback against my position, a really good point, but the way I see this is that you don't mean what you think you mean. Right? In the example that I used is you think you're over here, in Africa being Igbo doing these things, but really what you are is participating in the great Christian ascension of mankind. And so let us, deploy you in an appropriate way. So it's the violence of meaning making, right? But the impetus to mean, I do see I see that as being embodied, as being human. So I do see it as fundamental.
How about it having both those meanings?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, not to. I would want to, take the fence off of it entirely.
So
by that label, and I would just also say about the human, right? That it wasn't too long ago when probably any number of us were not considered human, right? So I mean, we know this thing's in flux. As we also know probably too that there are a lot of things that we've applied to ourselves, metals and all sorts of things that we see as part of our person.
Worth attempting closure in this regard. Here's what I want to at least challenge us to think about. I'm going to put it slightly differently from before. That we think of a default position or baseline, the qualifications that need to be respected for differences around the world, that situation is relatively late, that we take for granted. That is around construction and maintenance, defense of large-scale structures of meaning. Now, I don't think this small-scale situation would need to be defined as blankness or total absence of, except from my point of view, a kind of rhetorical